The other aspect that's mentioned here is the aspect of self-knowledge. He goes on to say, well-adjusted people have some awareness of their own motives and feelings. Although none of us can fully understand our feelings of behavior, normal people do not hide important feelings and motives from themselves. They have more self-awareness than individuals who are diagnosed as mentally ill. Self-knowledge. Self-knowledge. Knowing the self. When we talk about a knowledge of reality, we're not only talking about a knowledge of that reality that lies outside of your body. We are also talking about the knowledge of reality that is inside your body and in your mind as well. So consequently then, a perception of reality means a perception both of external and internal reality. And it means then, if we need to know what is going on the outside, to be able to see, taste, smell, feel what is on the outside, then we need equally as well to be able to know what is going on the inside. If not knowing, if not being able to perceive what is going on in the outside reality cripples us, makes us stumble over reality, makes us inefficient in coping with that reality, then not knowing ourselves also creates the same kind of problem. Hence we fall over our own minds, our own sense of self, and our own being. We have to recognize when we looked at the African man in slavery that the African could not be an African and a slave at the same time. You can't be an African and a slave at the same time. You cannot be a real black African person and be under the control of the European at the same time. Therefore, the slave master recognized this right away. And consequently, he set to work immediately to remove the African nature from the African person. Which means then if he removed the African nature, he took away the self-knowledge necessary for that individual to define himself. He took away the values, took away the cultural mores and ethics, the cultural way of perceiving and dealing with reality. He took away then the self-definition. That is why, of course, we don't find ourselves in history. That is why the anthropology distorts the perception of the African. That is why economics is not adequately explained in terms, in relationship to our people. That is why the religion is distorted and used against us. We've told you many times that you have to recognize that the Europeans' position depends upon the subordination of the African peoples. And consequently, every institution in the European system has as its center the maintaining of the status quo. That is why I've often said everything has to be reversed when it comes to the African person. When you send your children to school, they must be made dumb in the same school that the white child is made smart in. Everything must be turned backwards. Welfare must keep you poor, we've said. Religion must send you to hell. And it is. Very much so. Some of you, if you took the time to study some of the people who founded your denominations, if you didn't know that they were the founder of your denomination, you'd swear they were crazy. And they were. Many of them were. Suffering from total hallucinations. And yet being able to convince millions of people that their hallucinations were for real. So as you follow them, you're going to follow them right into hell. because many of them started out with very corrupt reasons and very corrupt purposes. They've been whitewashed over time, but the record is quite clear in many of them. So what we must have then in the system then is one where each institution works backwards. The school system then must make us ignorant. The church must send us to hell. The welfare and the economic system must keep us poor. The correction system must turn us into criminals. The psychiatric system must keep us crazy. And the whole business, as you look at the institution, you will see it does not work for our people. It means then that these institutions are dedicated to removing self-knowledge as a part of our personalities as a people. It means then that a new personality has to have been installed in the African body. And this is a part of the brainwashing process. The first aspect of the brainwashing process is to remove the individual's original identity, to degrade that original identity, to make the individual reject that original identity, and then, in a sense, to hand him a new identity, and to put in his place a new personality. Hence, I've said many times, the African man, as we see him today, is a created man, is a Frankenstein creation of the European. Amen. We talk in psychology about conditioning, how you condition a rat, or how you condition a dog, and you put them, for instance, you put that rat in a box, and you determine when it's going to get fed, and for what reason it's going to get fed, and you train it that it has to perform a particular behavior in order to get fed or to get water, so that in the end this rat then acquires what we call a new behavior. It acquires a new way of dealing with the world as a result of being placed in those particular conditions. So we look at conditioning as learning, but note also conditioning means to have to live under certain conditions. And one thing that the human brain is about is that it's essentially a learning instrument. That is why we come into the world not pre-wired as lower animals, but the brain is more like a computer, so that it programs its environment and takes in its environment and then begins to orient the person's behavior in terms of that program. In a sense then, ladies and gentlemen, we not only live in an environment, but what? The environment lives in us. You not only then live under certain conditions, but the conditions live in you as a people. That rat then, as a result of being put in that condition of the Skinner box, itself becomes conditioned. And you can tell that it has been in the box by looking at its behavior, which means that the condition now has inculcated itself into the very brains of that rat, and it comes out into its very behavior. When you let then another people determine the conditions under which you must live as a people, then those people are creating you the same way the rat's behavior is created by the conditions under which it must live. I tell my students then, when you look at the Skinner experiment, the rat in the box, you must not look at it just the way it's described in the book. You see, the book will say, well, you know, the rat is in the box, and if it pushes the lever, then the pellet of food falls down and it eats the food. And after a while, it learns the association between pushing the lever down and getting the food. Hence, it is conditioned. And they play all kinds of games with that. And see a good old black student, he comes in there and he learns all of that, man. And he figures he's equally educated with the white boy. Oh, man, I know this conditioning. He may even come out Phi Beta Kappa. First in his class. Stupid, though. Stupid. Stupid. Very stupid. Very stupid. In fact, his very Phi Beta Kappa kid is going to make him stupid. Because he's going to get pride out of it. And you're not going to be able to tell him anything. Why, I got my doctorate from Harvard. You're going to tell me? But, ladies and gentlemen, if that class did not tell him that he is the rat, he's been miseducated. That the relationship between the rat in that box and the experimenter is not merely an experiment in conditioning, it also represents a political situation. And it represents a set of power relationships. And that the rat is created more through the power relationships than it is through the so-called experiment. But it isn't described this way in the general psychology text. The experimenter has what? Power. And the rat is relatively what? Powerless. And therefore the experimenter can put this powerless rat into this condition. Because if the rat had power, he would dare him to do it. And say, you're not going to put me in that box. I'll put you in the box, but you're not going to put me in the box. But the rat, having not that power, is not able to do it. And now the experimenter uses his power. I'll feed you when you do this. I'll send an electric shock through you when you do that. When I turn this light on, you eat. When I turn it off, you don't. And then so if that student doesn't learn that, he's been miseducated. I don't care what an A he makes in the course. He's been made stupid by the very education. If he's not told then and asked the question, let's look at Harlem and let's look at the other ghettos of the world, and these include whole nations. Who's feeding you? Where do you get your food from? Don't you know you're locked in here? And if someone ran a blockade around your community today, you'd literally starve to death. Who's bringing the waters into your community and into your house? The oil, the gas, the lights, the jobs. And when you look at it, you see again a what? Power relationship. And do you think these people who control these essential things are going to be foolish enough to manipulate them in a way such that you will not be controlled in the sense that they want you to be controlled as a people? That they are not going to use this power to create into us a type of personality that is compatible with their own system and with their status quo? You would do it if you had the power. And of course, in a sense, this is the way reality works. And this is the way the people have worked this. And the idea then that you will let another group of people have this much power and control over the very vital resources of the world and over the very vital things for life itself means in a sense then that we are letting them have control to a great extent over our personality, and in a sense they have created this personality. And therefore what they have done is introjected into us the kind of personality that is suitable to their continuing domination of the world itself. And an essential part of removing, an essential part of creating that personality is to remove the knowledge of ourselves as people. When you don't know your history, you don't know yourself. And I mean that personally. For you as an individual are the end point of the history of your people. What our people have been through is represented in your behavior. You know, you hear some of us, some foolish among us, Well, that was 300 years ago. That was so many years ago. Well, it got nothing to do with today. You want to talk about that old slavery? We should put that behind us. In other words, you have some people who are crying out for amnesia. Let us forget all about that. But ladies and gentlemen, the human being does not operate, the human mind does not operate in that fashion. One of the fascinating things about the human mind is particularly when we talk about the concept of the unconscious, is the fact that your body and your mind can be operated by ideas which you yourself do not even know that you have. And that's a fascinating thing about the human mind, isn't it? That there can be wishes and ideas and values and impulses inside your mind, and as far as you are concerned, they are not there at all, and yet those impulses and ideas are directing your behavior. It's a very peculiar thing about human beings. And what am I saying here then? Simply because you may not know something about yourself, and simply because you think that something in your personality does not exist, does not mean that it does not exist, and does not mean that it is not there affecting your behavior. The black child at this very moment, even though it may know nothing about the slave experience of black people, is still influenced by that experience. The lack of knowledge about our experience of people then does not exempt that experience from operating in our behavior. The experience then of our people becomes apparent when we look at the behavior of our people, even though we may not know the history of the influences that are working on us. The idea that you have not read slave history and dealt with slave history does not mean that you have escaped having a slave mentality. In fact, it makes the slave mentality operate more forcefully and unimpeded in the personality. And that is why, of course, this self-knowledge had to be removed from our people. It becomes interesting to note then what we call the multiple personality, which is, when you look at them, it's a very interesting phenomenon. You know, some of you saw Three Faces of Eve, right? That movie. And some of you saw Sybil, the girl with 17 personalities or 18, whatever. And yet you can see that those personalities existed, many of them independent of each other. The interesting thing we found out about personality lately is the fact that these personalities not only take over the mind of the individual, but they really take over the body of the individual as well. They take over the body to such an extent that if you give each personality an EEG examination, each one will show distinct differences. In other words, then, a person who has more than one personality, when you test their brainwave patterns, it will be as if you were dealing with individuals with different brains. Quite a fundamental thing we're saying here. In other words, each personality carries with it a characteristic brain. Even though it's using the same brain, it's a different brain. If you give each personality an intelligence test, you're talking about the same person with the same brain now, the intelligence test scores will differ. Which indicates again here, depending on what personality has your brain under its control, you can be dumb or smart. We've seen those. Also, more fundamentally, some recent information came out that showed, in one instance, a woman who had diabetes in one personality when the other personality took over, the diabetes was absent. Same body. How do you explain this? Some personalities are allergic to one thing, and the other personality is allergic to something else. Same nose, same body. So when the individual is in one personality, they can't stand this food, and when they're in the other, they can't stand that one. And when they're in the other one, the one they couldn't stand in one personality, now they can eat without any reaction. Hope you're getting what I'm implying here, ladies and gentlemen. I'm trying to talk about then how the implantation, when you let another people implant a personality into you, how then it can take your whole body and your whole brain and your whole mind. To a very great extent, the sicknesses of our people, the cancer that our people suffer from, the high blood pressure, the heart disease, all of the other diseases for which our people are dying at 4 and 5 times the rate of the Caucasian is the result of that implanted personality into the black body itself. An implanted personality that is cooperating with the European in such a way that it is literally committing suicide and works toward its own destruction. A personality that is literally then taught to be dumb. We notice then when you have these different personalities, one can be perceptive, another one very dull. One can be very legalistic, another one can be very confused. In other words, then, when you let another people create and implant into your personality, they will implant the kind of personality that is consistent with their civilization. And you must understand then that a major part of liberation of black people then is what we call self-creation. Which means then that it is essential that we be in control of the conditions under which we exist as a part of creating our own self. But a people who are not aware of themselves and have no self-knowledge are unable to do so. It's interesting to note that the foundations of the human personality are laid between the ages of birth and 2 to 3 years old. And that's a peculiarity of human beings in a way. In other words, then, much of the way I behave and we behave in general is the result of things that occur to us between the ages of birth and 3 years old. And yet, how many of you can recall in very vivid detail when you were 2 years old and 3 years old? Certainly you may remember 1 or 2 things, but the greater part of those years are buried and lost to you. But do you understand what we're getting at here now? In other words, we are saying the very things that direct our personalities and the very things which are the foundation of our behavior and attitudes toward the world are the very things we can't what? We can't remember. We can't recall. We can't get to. And yet they are there directing us, creating our reactions, creating how we see the world, our attitudes and our tastes and our values and so forth. And what I'm trying to then say by analogy then is simply because you don't know yourself or you don't read your history or have a knowledge of your history does not mean then you're not victimized by that history. And therefore one of the major things then that helps to keep us out of our minds as a people is that we do not know ourselves. And we don't know then the sources of our behavior. And you get then many people asking, why do we behave this way? Why can't we get together? Why can't we trust each other? Why is it that our organizations don't work out? That's the sign of a people who what? Don't know themselves. When you have to keep asking yourself these kind of questions, which is what we hear every day all the time, it means then that self-knowledge is lacking. And ladies and gentlemen, those questions can be found by studying and reading one's own history. But you've been frightened of that history because you've been told that that history is one of shame. When you read it, you get angry. You get guilty. You feel anxiety. And therefore, you tend to stay away from it because it is so-called unpleasant. And this, of course, is why people are kept away from truth. This is why in this world that is run by liars, we love the lies that we are told. This is why we work very hard to be taught the lies by these people. Because the lies make us feel good and the truth makes us feel bad. And therefore we avoid the truth. Why is the neurotic individual twisted? Because the traumatic event that made him or her neurotic is the event that he cannot face. The event that he cannot relive again. The event that he wants to keep out of his mind. And therefore keeping it out of his mind and denying its existence, it is free then to influence his or her behavior. And the longer then we as people keep away from a deep knowledge of ourselves and a confrontation with ourselves, then the longer we stay out of our minds as a people. The other thing then is we don't know our enemy as well. For the histories you read in these schools are not the history of the European. For they are lying histories as well. Any good reading of American history with these so-called Puritans. You know, I was looking at a movie here around Thanksgiving. It was a very interesting little movie that slipped through there. Spencer Tracy was on this ship, and he was the captain of the ship, and these Puritans were on board, you know, these holy, sanctimonious people. And he treated them very roughly. And one day they got around to asking him, says, Captain, why do you hate us? He says, I hate you because I know you are a bunch of hypocrites. That you are going to go over there with your piety and rape and rob the savages of everything they got while you're pretending to be religious. And so you get a history of a people looking for religious freedom and religious expression while they hung and strung Indians and robbed and stole and killed and did everything possible. But these were the people who taught you how to be a religious person, aren't they? Yes. But you're not taught that in your little high school and your little college histories, are you? No. You're taught that Thanksgiving, these people, do you know Thanksgiving is an Indian holiday? Taken from the Indians? Not a European holiday? And after these Europeans had their butts saved from starvation and death, they rewarded the Indian with death and destruction. But no, we get a purified history, a history that is sanitized and untruthful. Just as you get a purified civics lesson. This is how a bill goes through Congress. Nothing about the wheeling and the dealing, nothing about the briberies, nothing about corruptions and the reality of the system. As a matter of fact, if you teach the realities of what's going on, you're seen as a bad teacher. I found it interesting if you read Kozo's book called Death at an Early Age, where he talks about educating black children in the Boston school systems and how he was fired by that system for reading Langston Hughes to a class of black students, because Langston Hughes was not on the approved reading list of the Boston schools at that time. In fact, no black poet was on the reading list. And then the poem he read was a poem about landlords. And he was also fired because his supervisor said, we don't want you reading poems to our children that are negative. We don't want our children to feel bad. You see. So then if you talk about reality, you make them feel bad and you make them feel anxiety and you make them see what the world is really about. We don't want them to experience that. And I found out, ladies and gentlemen, then that what we call education is an education into fairy tales. Because the teacher doesn't want to feel uncomfortable, or they don't want to make the students feel uncomfortable. So therefore, we talk to you in such intellectualized and abstract language until then you can read and talk without having any real emotional experiences, and therefore not confront the world for what it is. And consequently then, the very education itself takes you away from self-knowledge and a knowledge of reality in and as it is. So then what we are saying, when you are not educated in terms of your history, you're not educated in terms of your experience, then you do not know from whence those impulses and compulsions in your personality spring. You do not know why you behave the way you do. Plus it means then that the feelings are out of control. The other characteristic mentioned here is the characteristic of called an ability to exercise voluntary control over behavior. Normal individuals feel fairly confident about their ability to control their behavior. How can you control your behavior if you don't have an efficient perception of reality? And you don't know what reality is. And you've been taught reality by people whose interest it is to keep you out of your mind. How can you have a voluntary control over your behavior when you have no self-knowledge? It's impossible. You hypnotize an individual, for instance, and you tell that individual, when I straighten up my collar, you're going to stand up and you're going to salute the flag of the United States of America. Now, you're not going to remember, though, that I told you this, but you're going to do it. Now, you wake him up out of his hypnotic state, and you talk and you do several things, and then and this individual who's been hypnotized, he may sit back and appear to be relaxed, but he's watching out of the corners of his eyes. He's sensitive to whatever move is being made by the hypnotist. Even though other people may not notice it, he's sensitized and he's alert, and since he's hyper alert to the movements that's going to be made by the hypnotist, such that when the hypnotist then starts to fiddle with his collar, he stands up and he hesitates for a moment, then he stands up and he begins to repeat the Pledge of Allegiance. And when you ask him then, why are you repeating this allegiance? He's not going to tell you, I don't know why. No, he's going to say, I think we should be more patriotic in this country. This country has been so good to us. We should pay great honor to the... Now, what is going on here? This is a typical example of what we call rationalization. Now, if you talk to that person who did that, the person would swear that what they are saying is what? It's true. It's true. And you could not convince them that what they are saying and the reason they are giving for their behavior is not truth. Even though you being a witness have seen why they're doing what they're doing. What we're looking at then is an individual who has no self-knowledge in this particular area. But despite that lack of self-knowledge, that individual's behavior is still controlled by that which he does not know. So consequently, that person has no control over that particular behavior. In other words, then, that behavior is involuntary, even though the individual may deceive himself into thinking that it is voluntary, that he did it of his own free will. You see, this system is a very slick one, ladies and gentlemen. It is a system that is bound to make you feel freest, at the very point when you're under its greatest control. It sort of reminds you of a person who's under the heavy sway of drugs. and who feels as free as a bird at the very moment the drug has the greatest control over his behavior. It's a part of this contradiction. And we have people then who think that they can be free while they're under the control of the European. And they're caught up. And who think then that they are controlling their behavior when what has happened, that implanted personality, that created personality is operating within their bodies and controlling their behaviors. And to a good extent then they spend their life rationalizing a behavior of which they do not really know the foundations. And therefore then a people who have little self-knowledge and a people who have no efficient perception of reality are a people then who are not really in control of their behavior.